oil drilling and vaping. And when I was putting it together, I realized, maybe some of the people I'm addressing don't really understand how this process works. And I know there's some confusion about the Constitution Revision Commission. So I'm going to start off today with a little bit of background on how this all works and how we come, or how, let's say, the commission comes to a decision, and how much input that they actually had before they actually took it down to the 14 amendments that we have. So anyway, so I just wanted to start off with a little bit of background. So this is the Constitution Revision Commission, right? That's his signature. We're going to talk specifically about Amendment 9. And Amendment 9 bans oil and gas drilling off the Florida coast and bans vaping in enclosed indoor workplaces. Right? So what's the history? Some of you may not be able to read all of that, but I'll talk to it, okay? First of all, Florida has had quite a history of politics and gerrymandering. Before 1968, in the 60s, there was actually, the power was mostly in the North. So they had the most representation, and the South had really very little representation, even though, as you can imagine, the population had shifted significantly to the South. So there was an election, and of course, because of the big districts that the North had, they tended to get more representatives. That's how they did it. Each district in the North had a significant number of representatives, which did not rarely represent the true population in the North. So there was a suit, and the Supreme Court came out and said, this is not representation, democracy, and therefore you have to change it and give the South more representation. Well, as we all know, based on Amendment 1, where we were supposed to get a lot more money into trust fund for property, they didn't do that. They just totally ignored it. So there was another election, and the Supreme Court disavowed the election. And so then they had to go back, and in the next election, 2 years later, they had done some improvement in it, and it's continuing even today. All right. So, but in the reflection, in coming up with something that would be acceptable to the Supreme Court, they came up with this idea of every 20 years having a commission to look at possible changes in the Constitution. And the first one was in 1968, where the Florida voters ratified 3 separate amendments. And one of those amendments including a provision requiring the CRC, or the Constitutional Revision Commission, to convene and examine the Florida Constitution once every 20 years for possible changes. And that first actual commission met in 1977, and they placed 8 proposed constitutional amendments, and none of them passed. Then in 1997 and 98, they placed 9 proposed, and they changed the majority, where normally it was just enough to get more than 50%. They changed it to a simple supermajority, which now in 2006 you need to have 60% of the vote to get it passed. And we all are aware of that. I think you know that in the recent constitutional amendments from the last election, we needed 60% or better to get that. Of course, we had I think it was 76% for Amendment 1, which they totally ignored. And now there's been a suit, and recently a district judge indicated that the legislature did not follow the spirit of Amendment 1 and have asked them to go back, and now is asking them to, let's revisit this and let's get it according to the intent, not by the interpretation that the legislatures are taking according to the way it was written. And as we all know, people can interpret writing in different ways. Well, that was not the intent, where they were giving it to buying cars and administrative costs, which is what they were doing under Scott. And now the judge is saying that's no longer applicable, and you have to go back and rethink this and do it according to the way it was the intent. In other words, putting about $300 million every year into the account. Since then, Scott and Pam Bondi, who is the Attorney General, have gone back and appealed that. We'll see where that goes. Right? So that kind of gives you a flavor of the Florida politics. Right? To get a measure on the ballot, there are actually 3 ways to do that. We can initiate it as citizens, and then we have to get a certain number of petitions, which in this case, in February of 2018, you needed 766,200 valid signatures. So they're checked and made sure that you are truly what you wrote in there, or you are truly a citizen of Florida. We had constitutional amendments. An example of that is to allow ex-convicts to regain their state voting rights. So that was an example of an individual petition that reached a certain number of 766,200 to get on the amendment. So that is a citizen-driven constitutional amendment. Then the Florida State Legislature can also put on a number of ballots if they wish. In order to do that, it requires a 60% supermajority vote in both legislative chambers. And there are now some of those that we will see in this election ballot in November are legislative driven. And then finally, you have the Revision Commission, which is meeting, as I said, every 20 years, and made up of 37-member commission. And the politics in that are quite interesting as well. I know somebody, and maybe you know her name is Jackie Thurlow-Lippisch. She lives in Martin County, and we know each other, and we've had a lot of discussions on her experiences. And it's been quite interesting to hear the politics that go back and forth, and how you have certain people who are progressive, and then you have the people in the legislature like Pam Bondi, who automatically has to be on that committee controlling about what's said and what's done. So any Florida citizen over 18 years old can offer a proposal. So our Democratic Caucus, for example, we offered, there was about 5 different proposals. Some of them were wrapped into the offshore oil drilling, because actually we did that. And it was bundled with a number of other people who had the same idea. We also put in one for fracking, and other people did as well. That did not get on the ballot. Okay, so the number of submissions, both from public and by commissioner proposals, was 905. So that's how many they had to come down to. And we had to come down, and they had to narrow it down, as you well know, as we'll go over in a few minutes. And in order for the final amendments that are on the ballot to be approved, it has to have greater than a 60% majority, okay, by the voter. Any questions on this before we get started? Hope I clarified that all right. This is the number, I'm sorry, I think I said 14, I meant 12. There are 12 total amendments, and some of them are bundled, and some of them are not, okay? So the problem, we'll talk about the bundling in just a moment, but the one we're going to talk about is right here, Amendment 9, which bans oil and gas drilling and vaping in enclosed indoor workplaces. All of these amendments have been discussed by the League of Women's Voters, which I think I had sent to Megan, and you have an example of that. But also, you have the Progressive Party, Susan Smith, who also we were working part of that committee as well, and we were giving opinions as to what we wanted to do there. And you have that input as well. There are a few differences between the League of Women Voters versus the Progressive Democratic Party. But for the most part, they're pretty much together. The one thing I wanted to talk about this ban on oil drilling was one of the ones that's pretty contentious is about the Homestead Act. And of course, they want to reduce the taxes or give a greater exemption on the homestead. You will see that both the League of Women Voters and the Progressive Party of the Democratic Party, they have said no to this. And that's why, because in a certain way, you're not going to win. You may see a reduction, but then the county will have to find that money that they're losing. So you're more or less damned if you do and damned if you don't. So it's a matter of how you want to do this, but that's why both groups are saying not to do this. It really has more an effect on the local politics, and the thing that many people are fighting in the counties is more freedom, and the state is constantly trying to take more responsibility away from the counties, and that's not what we want. All right, the rationale for bundling more than one amendment with another. Now, there is no one right answer for this. And I quite frankly don't know what is the true rationale that's in a 37-member. But I did talk to Jackie Thurl-Lippisch. I did talk to a few other people who gave us some input on what was being discussed amongst themselves. Maybe not open publicly, but this is what I got out of the discussions. When the citizens initiate a proposed constitutional amendment, actually the opinion of most people is it should be a single subject to go up or down. Okay, and I think everybody agrees with that. But Florida allows for bundling. And why is that? Some commissioners contend that the bundling helps alleviate ballot fatigue. Well, to some extent that's true. I mean, if you had a long list of ballots, the attention span of the average person coming in to carry out the ballots maybe is not as long as people would like it to be, and they're concerned that they'll never get to the end of the ballots that need to be approved or rejected. So there is some concern about how much confusion there would be to have so many particular items on the ballot. So that's one reason. And they feel that a confused voter is likely to say no because they just don't trust the system, which is probably true. So they're also concerned about that. So depending on what side something is bundled on, it may or may not be a bad thing. Bob Martinez, a litigation attorney from Coral Gables and a member of the Constitution Revision Commission, urged his colleagues to abandon the bundling approach and place only single-issue ballots. But also, there's a counter-argument that says bundling makes it harder to litigate. So let's use, for example, the oil drilling and the vaping as an example. All right? So the petroleum industry wants to kill this. So they have a big mass amount of money going in if it's a single item. And the voter gets confused and maybe it doesn't pass. If you bundle it together with vaping, it makes it harder to litigate because you have to include vaping as part of that. It's a single entity. And so that gets a little bit more difficult to really be clear as to why you don't want a particular constitutional amendment passed. That is what was indicated. Whether you agree with that is, of course, something you have to decide, but that's some of the reasons and rationale why they bundle. Now, originally, as Amendment 9 first started, it was Proposition 91. And this was the sign or the symbol that was given, P91 for Proposition 91, and yes, no oil and gas drilling. So that was a common symbol that was used at the very beginning when the Constitutional Revision Committee was in session. And basically, what is Amendment 9? Well, Amendment 9 would prohibit drilling either for exploration or extraction of oil and natural gas. And that's important because originally it was just said for oil, and that would have been a way out. So they actually saw that and put in natural gas. In state waters. This prohibition would include ocean from shoreline to the outermost boundaries. And the measure would not affect, though, this is something that some people was a compromise, would not affect the transportation of oil and natural gas products that were produced outside the state waters. So in federal waters, if you have a drilling rig, they can bring supplies back and forth, and even transportation of oil and natural gas products. So that is in there as well. Not perfect, but it's a start. Now, the question that one would come up with is, well, what's territorial waters? How big is it? How wide is it? Well, the recognized coastal definition, and I took this out, I went on to Google because I wanted to find out, and they actually have exactly what are the coastal territorial waters, and surprisingly, the Gulf Coast is different than the East Coast, and that was something that I did not know. So the Gulf of Mexico coastline is 3 marine leagues, or 9 nautical miles, which is approximately 10 miles. So on the west coast of Florida, the territorial waters extend out 10 miles, okay? Which was more than I thought it was, quite frankly, because I kept thinking it was 3. Well, it is 3, but for the Atlantic coast. The Atlantic coast is 3 nautical miles, or about 3.5 miles. So the Atlantic coast is 3.5 miles, this territorial waters. No oil or drilling theoretically could take place if this amendment passes. And on the Gulf Coast side, it would be 10 miles. Okay? Now, 10 miles may seem like a lot to you, and it is relatively a lot. However, I bring up the BP oil spill and how far it reached to Florida from Texas and Louisiana. So I just want to bring out to you that 10 miles is not so great, but that's what we have to work with. The Gulf of Mexico is really the target, right? So this comes down to economics. The Gulf is shallow. It's lower cost for drilling versus the Atlantic coast. Existing infrastructure is already there. You have pipelines, you have boats, you have manpower, inventory. Everything is in the Gulf, as you well know. You know about all the oil rigs that are out there, I'm sure. The cost of drilling versus failure is being competed also with non-fossil fuel alternatives as Florida becomes more solar energy, turns to more solar energy. We're going to see a reduction in gas, or the need for natural gas. So, and this is not only happening along Florida, it's happening in other states as well. So you're going to look for, if you're going to drill anywhere, you're going to have the most risk because there is a payout. There is a certain amount of time when you put in an investment that you need a return on that investment. And so I think you can imagine that in a more shallow area like the Gulf of Mexico, your costs are going to be so much less, your return on investment is so much quicker than drilling off the coast on the East Coast side. Right? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Everybody? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. And of course, they have to compete now with solar, wind. I mean, even Florida Power and Light's starting to get much more involved, having these solar clubs and saying we'll rent you the equipment. And of course, the big change, I believe, personally, paradigm shift type stuff, is when we have the solar shingles and when they become much more competitive. Now they say within 3 to 5 years. Well, if that's the case, and people start putting that on their roofs, people are going to have a lot more electrical generation. Personally, they're going to have control over their own energy, especially as batteries develop, and they won't need as much energy from the power companies, which means they need less natural gas, which means that somebody else is going to have to buy it. That coupled with what's going on in Europe and what's going on in China, which truly is the leader in solar energy and will continue to be so because of their pollution. I happen to have the experience of going to China when I was working for the company I work for with Berkshire Hathaway, and this was a real eyesore when you couldn't go outside because they declared a pollution air day, and schools were not allowed, students were not allowed to go to school because the air was so bad in Beijing and Shanghai. It really was. It was incredible. If you wore a mask, You took the mask off that day, and it would be all brown or black because of the soot from the coal burning that they are now trying to replace. So they are really doing a great emphasis on this, and because of the type of government they have, it will come faster than anything that we would probably do. So, as I said, the Gulf of Mexico is the real target. The petroleum industry has formed a consortium to bypass public and work with legislators to approve drilling off Florida. Now, the reason why they have done this is because of the past history of politics in Florida. Take Amendment 1. Again, they didn't follow it. The legislators decided that they would do it in cooperation with Governor Scott to use the money for other than what was originally intended. So the petroleum industry is thinking, maybe we can do the same thing, and that's what they're doing. Now, they've had a couple of setbacks. They've had a judge come back and say, legislator, you didn't follow the intent of Amendment 1, so we're going to start looking at that, and we want to come back and follow that. So that discussion is under appeal, but I expect that probably we will win that. And then they're going to have to come back and actually use the money for what was originally intended. If that occurs, then indeed that will make it more difficult for petroleum industry to bypass, if this amendment is approved by the majority of Floridians, 60% or greater, and that will make it more difficult for them to go around that amendment and the will of the people. Okay, so what else is in Amendment 9? Well, bans for vaping in enclosed indoor workplaces. So this is actually the amendment. The amendment would prohibit the use of vapor-generating electronic devices in enclosed indoor workplaces. The measure would make exceptions for use of vapor-generating electronic devices in private residence that are not being used for commercial child care, adult care, health care, and retail tobacco and vapor-generating electronic device shops, designed smoking guest rooms in hotels and standalone bars. Right? So basically, what it is just an extension of the common cigarette ban, and that's all it is. So if somebody asks you, what is the rule on vaping? All it is just the extension of the current law that bans cigarette smoking in public places. That's it. It's no different. And it gives exceptions, just like for cigarettes, in places like smoke shops or vapor shops or wherever cigarette smoking is permitted, like in an airport where you can go into a special room and smoke. You can do vaping there as well. So it's no different. It just brings vaping into line with current regulations because it had kind of gotten under the radar screen. That's all we're doing here. So I think that probably explains Amendment 9. So the summary of Amendment 9 is bundled, and it is bans offshore oil and gas drilling and bans vaping in enclosed indoor workplaces. All right, so let's discuss some of the things that are going on right now as far as how people are reacting. As you would expect, the petroleum industry is opposed to the ban on drilling. Surprise, surprise, right? They say that it will create thousands of jobs. Okay, let's talk about that. Let's talk about tourism in Florida. So now we have a catastrophe like BP, shuts down the tourism industry, which is how many jobs are going to be affected by hotels and restaurants because people are not coming to the beaches because of all the tar that is accumulated on the beach. Right? I think it's a little bit bigger than thousands of jobs, number one. Number two, I don't believe personally that they will create that many jobs in the long term because you have the competition of the non-fossil fuel for Florida. And it's just not going to be all that attractive if there's no place to use it. If we, as I said earlier, that the Florida Power and Light and other utilities are moving more and more to solar energy, which means that they're using the need for natural gas is reduced. Where are they going to use the natural gas? They're going to have to go and use it somewhere else. I don't think that they're going to try and build up a great deal of refining in a state which is turning to solar energy. They're going to go to a state which supports them. and that's going to probably be Texas or Louisiana. So I don't really think those jobs are coming to Florida. If there are jobs, they're going to Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, whoever is more kind to their position. The chambers of commerce are all in support of the ban on drilling. And as I said before, they know that if there's an oil spill, what's going to affect especially the western coast of Florida, because as I said before, that's really the target because of the shallow depth of Gulf of Mexico. And they didn't do this when some years ago, it was in the 90s, I believe, there actually was a similar idea to ban drilling. And there were very few chambers of commerce that actually supported it, and it didn't really come about. Well, it didn't come about, as a matter of fact. So now this is going to be done, and it's similar to what we have in the 90s, and now all the Western chambers of commerce are supporting it because they have an idea of what can happen thanks to BP. All right, so let's go on. Now, the AFL-CIO is putting out a document where they are opposing the amendment number 9 because of the vaping. And so I talked to an attorney for AFL-CIO, and I said, why are you doing this? And there were 2 reasons. One is the link of jobs, which the AFL-CIO is in the petroleum industry, and they're being smoothed over and saying, you know, we can bring in a lot of jobs, and the AFL-CIO says, oh, that's great. So there's some bonding going on between the petroleum industry and AFL-CIO. Then the other reason I was told was because of individual rights on vaping. They don't feel that it's right that you should restrict their vaping, even though it's no different than a cigarette. But they just don't, some people just aren't for it. So it looks like AFL-CIO is going to oppose the Amendment 9 based on vaping. And the idea of being pretty much romanced on jobs for the oil industry. The Cancer Society is in support of the ban. I think that's obvious. Why? Because a lot of the vaping has gone to underage, gotten through the loophole, and that has tobacco, and they're concerned about getting people addicted on tobacco through vaping. So that's also, so I think we're going to find really a lot of significant groups supporting this amendment for one reason or another. All right, I'm going to finally end up with a thought for you. This is something from Carl Wickstrom, who is who just recently passed away, and he was a strong environmentalist and conservationalist. He was very much behind the Amendment 1 strategy. The people who decide which and how much of the public's property may be taken for private profit, whether it be property as fish, wildfowl, or offshore oil, simply cannot be the same people who profit. And I thought that was very indicative of what we are talking about today. So I open it up for any questions. That's the end of the presentation. So I hope